Well, good morning, everybody. Woo, there it is. I got one solid, strong good morning already. How are we doing? All right. Hey, it's an honor to be with you guys this morning as we listen to Scott Feather for the next 10 hours. Tell us what end is up in this world, right, Scott?
No, sir.
I am really honored to be with you this early on a Saturday morning, and we are hopeful for a great day in front of us. We have a group right here, of course. About 50 people will be in the room this morning, at least have registered, and about the same amount will be ultimately getting the video feed. So we're going to be recording this morning and getting that out to those who are interested on the back end. Just so you know who in the world we are, neither one of us are experts in this field. So we want to put that on the table to begin with. All right, we are two guys essentially who want to find a way to start a conversation that can help us navigate space that can be very divisive and very controversial and very emotionally laden, very difficult. And so we don't consider ourselves to have nailed content or to deliver to you something that is of incredible expertise, but we do have an interest in figuring out how we can talk through some challenging times. And we have certainly been through some of those seasons. Just so you know a little bit about me, then I'm going to let you share here, Scott. For those in the room who don't know me and those listening online later, Tim Rogers, I'm the lead pastor at Grace Point Church. I've been there about 18 years, which is right down the road here in Paradise. Been married to my wife, Jen. We are married. We're going to be coming up on 23 years here in May. I know I got married when I was 25, when I was 2, right? Is that right? I don't know when you got married. I'm 25 anyway. That joke didn't work at all. Anyway. All I have to say, we got 3 kids as well. Grateful for them. 1 in college, 2 in high school. And for me, by the way, just for the fun of it on the side, I enjoy a number of outdoor activities. I enjoy cycling, bicycling, like pedal bike, not motorcycling. It's a fun thing. I also am a basketball coach at Factory Valley. Enjoy that opportunity as well. But the reason I'm doing this thing, then I'm going to let you go, Scott, the reason that I'm even here doing this True-False seminar, maybe like you, I have had friendships deeply impacted in the past year by some of the division that we have seen really rise up and increase. And it's been hard. And as a believer in Jesus Christ, I've also seen the Christian community, in my opinion, my estimation, lose some of its witness around a conversation of truth and the challenge of knowing and identifying what is true and even what is not true. And so I was sitting around thinking, what do I do about this? Like, is there anything to do? Do I just throw up my hands and say, that's the way life is, and go about my business? And I felt like that's not a good enough answer for me, at least. And so wanting to engage, both because of a personal relational level and also at a corporate kind of Christian witness level, the need, in my opinion, to be able to talk about truth, identify it, and figure out what in the world it actually is, especially compared to the conspiracies and deception and misinformation that we're trying to deal with globally. So that is why I'm here at a personal level. So that's a little bit about me. Scott, my friend.
Yeah, on a personal level, my name's Scott. I have the privilege of being a pastor right down the road, the opposite direction from Tim. Tim and I met for the first time at September Farms by accident, I think. And from the first time I met him, I'm like, I like that guy. And so anyway, I'm a pastor down the road at Gateway Church. I've been there for only 6 years, not 18 years. Congratulations on that, man.
Thank you.
That's really cool. I have 2 kids. One of them is 20, and I think is planning a wedding. I guess I have to plan it too, next year, even though the engagement hasn't happened yet. Hasn't times changed? Like, remember when you didn't talk about a wedding until there was a ring on the finger? But anyway, so we've got that kind of stuff going on, and then I've got an 18-year-old son who's graduating high school this year and then headed off to a Christian college in the Midwest. And he's one of my best friends, hopefully not inappropriately so. You know how you can be that way inappropriately with your kids, but he's like one of my best friends, and so I don't know what I'm going to do when he's gone. So Tim, I might come. I'm not going to go cycling with you. I'm not going to do all that kind of stuff, but I may show up at your house more often.
You will. We'll get you there. Scott, thank you. Are you done, or did I step on your sentence?
No, I'm done.
He's done. Okay. We might go back and forth like this because we're figuring that out along the way. So here, let me open with this. When we talked about this idea of why we're here, right? One thing I didn't share that's very important to me is that the topic, the matter of how do we love our enemies well, right? So because I call myself a Christian, fundamentally, Christians claim that one of their greatest values is that they're people of love, and they've been saved by a Savior who demonstrated love at an incredible way of dying on the cross, and then gave that commission to people who'd say, hey, I'm going to follow you by saying, hey, do the same thing. Love your enemies, right? It's an incredibly challenging thing to do when you think about the politically and socially diverse world that we're in right now. And when I think about what's going on, I love what Dan White tweeted just a couple of days ago. Here's what he had to say. He's an author and also former pastor. He went on a book tour in 2019. He said this: he did a straw poll on my book tour, 13 cities with 829 people in 2019. 76% of those who identified as progressive see loving enemies as complicity with injustice. So if you lean left and you hear the phrase loving your enemies, you have to process, if I love the people who are on my right, I may be complicit with the injustice that I think they support. And then he said 78% of those who identified as conservative see loving enemies as compromise with immorality. So if you lean right, you see those on your left, and you hear loving your enemies, you think, well, I'm not sure I can do that because I'm going to have to compromise my high moral standards. And then he finished his tweet this way. He said, think we got a problem? I think we do. And thus the nature of our True or False seminar here. How can we love enemies and navigate through this space?
And this is really tough. I mean, we all have biases, right? Whether we like to admit it or not. So I want to reveal some of my biases to you. I believe that Jesus Christ is the way, the truth, and the life. So I think truth is found in the person of Jesus Christ, and I think truth flows from the person of Jesus Christ. And so you may be here today, and Jesus is not part of your equation when you think about life and the way that it should be lived. It's absolutely fine. We're glad you're here, but I wanted you to know that about me. And so part of what happens for me when this whole thing that has happened over the past couple of months, or even longer than that, is that I believe that division hurts the heart of God. I believe it hurts the heart of God. In fact, Jesus himself in John 17 prays for unity. And he says, this is how everyone is going to know that you are my disciples, that you love one another. And yet, in today's world, it kind of goes like this. Information has always been open to interpretation. You ever had that with somebody? Maybe it's with your spouse. You both see the exact same thing, but you come to different conclusions on that. And yet, I will tell you, I'm not sure in my young life, 48 years old, that I've seen the debate as strong when people are looking at the exact same set of facts. And so that's interesting to me. I used an example a couple of months ago in a sermon at our church, and it was off the cuff, which is why I speak by notes, because when I go off the cuff, it goes bad. So it started to go bad, and I wanted to use an illustration, and I'm scanning the crowd, and I see a guy in a Cardinals t-shirt, a St. Louis Cardinals t-shirt. And I thought to myself, oh good, I'll use that. And I thought, no, my wife yells at me for using too many sports analogies. So instead of picking on him for wearing a Cardinals shirt, I said something like, well, I don't like people that wear red. I could have said Cardinal shirts, but I said red. After the sermon, someone came up to me, and my use of that example proved to them that I was a liberal Democrat because I didn't like red. And so it's strange to me that in that moment I thought, don't use a sports example, but I didn't even cross my mind that somebody could connect red. Does that make sense? And so it just feels like it's a little bit out of control. I have been sent more videos and more articles in the past year than I have in my whole entire life. And I'm a consumer of that kind of stuff, so I love to read and I love to watch it, but it's been different than ever before. I've been called a socialist and a liberal for the first time in my entire life. And I haven't known what to do with that. I don't think I'm a socialist. I think I'm politically and theologically conservative, but in today's day and age, things get a little crazy. Had another conversation, sorry Tim, I'll let it go back to you in a second. Had another conversation one time with somebody at our church. This was earlier this year, and I just said, how you doing? And they said, not great, but March 4 is coming. Not great, but March 4 is coming. And I'll be honest, in that moment, sometimes I will say to somebody, well, what's on March 4th? And other times I'll just be like, yeah, and then I'll go home and Google it. right? And so I did. I'm like, wow, man, that's great. And then I went home and Googled it. And of course, March 4th, there was a lot of people that believed that on March 4th, President Biden was no longer going to be president, and Donald Trump was going to be president on March 4th. And so now all of a sudden I was like, well, now what do I do with that information? And it's hard. So I believe that the church is supposed to be salt and light. The question is, are we that? Here's two quotes that I just wanted you to see that have helped me over the past year. And the first one is by Stuart Chase, and he was an American economist that died in 1985. But here's what he said. For those who believe, no proof is necessary. For those who don't believe, no proof is possible. And I found that he wasn't even talking about politics at this point, but I think about this in many ways, politically and even about the person of Jesus Christ, right? Like, it's hard for me, like, I almost don't think I need proof, and yet possibly for you, no proof could be good enough, right? And so this is an interesting tension for me. And then the last one, I'll turn it over to, is this one. This is another quote by a guy who did quantum mathematics. I can't even spell quantum, right? And so like a brain, but here's what he said. I would rather have questions that cannot be answered than answers that cannot be questioned. And so this, outside of God's word, for me, these two quotes have helped guide me over the past year in trying to figure out what steps to take.
Absolutely. Scott, thank you. I can resonate with a lot of that, and maybe you guys can as well, what you've been called or what you thought of others or what have you over the years. I just want to make a couple more comments, and we want to turn to your tables and want to let you introduce yourselves to each other and kind of ask, what are you aiming at during this session as well? But before I do that, I want to introduce to you this box that I have sitting in front of me. It's not a mistake. This is actually a little box that I got something in from Amazon. I don't know if any of y'all order stuff from Amazon and then it comes in a box and you're like, I can't wait to find out what's in the box because I forgot what I ordered, right? That was what this was. The reason I want to throw this box out is because I want to use it as an illustration for a concept that C.S. Lewis introduced a long time ago called the Bulverism fallacy. I think he made the word up, and he made up a fictional character named Mr. Bulver, I believe. But here's the deal. If I were to tell you that I have $1,000 in my box, the question for you becomes, from your vantage point, how are you going to discern if I'm telling you the truth or if I'm deceiving you? And the answer to that is the only way for you to tell if I have $1,000 in my little box or not is to actually get my box and open the box and then count up the bills that I do or don't have in this box, right? So the point of the Bulverism fallacy is it essentially says this, that you must show that a man is wrong before you show why he is wrong. Here's what I mean. If you were to open this box and you were to find out the truth, and the truth is there's air in this box and not $1,000, I hate to disappoint you all, but if you were to do that and you were to say, man, I knew Tim is fill in the blank. You begin to judge me for my statement at that point. You might say, Tim is a eternal optimist. He hopes that there'll be something in the box, but you can't really trust him because he's so hopeful. You might say Tim is manipulative and deceptive. You might say Tim is a liberal. That's why he said there's 1,000 in the box. You might say Tim is a conservative. That's why he said there's 1,000 in the box. But before you judge why I'm wrong, you must determine that I am wrong. And so what we see, and what I would argue we see over and over in society is this, is that someone will make a claim about, you name it. We can't tell if it's wrong, but we will judge why they are wrong before we judge that they are wrong. And what we want to do this morning is take the matters that are in front of us and say, what actually is in the box, if you will? So a conspiracy, an idea that's planted. If Scott is to be the peddler of truth, if he was to lay out, here's what I think is true, it's important for me not to just judge Scott on the basis of a character trait and say, well, all liberals are that way. All conservatives are that way. People who are pro-life are this way. People who are of this skin color or this skin color are that way. That's the Bulverism fallacy that says, here's the reason why you're wrong. I don't need to know that you are wrong. I just can explain why you're wrong based on what I think about you. And so the Bulverism fallacy encourages us to stop and say, an argument must be determined based on the logical proof of whether it exists or not. And so I want to encourage us to consider that we can judge what is true, not why it is necessarily first. So with that being said, with that as background, what we're trying to do here today, here's some things we're aiming at, and I'm going to put it out this way. What we're aiming at together in this seminar is this. Number one, we want to get to an increasing awareness of Christian nationalism. The reason for that is we want to understand what is behind and what is the worldview and framework in which we are living in here in the United States. We want to have that conversation. Number two, we want to have a greater understanding of the factors that contribute to the evolving witness of the evangelical church, meaning that we believe that the evangelical church's witness is evolving. It's changing, and trying to understand what is contributing to the evolving witness of that space. Number three, we do want to identify some handles, some tools, ways to discern what is true from what is a conspiracy. And number four, how we can actually live with grace and truth in this moment. So the idea being, what does it look like for you and I to interact with each other when there are incredible differences in the room, especially when you don't agree with me and I don't agree with you.
So here's a couple of commitments that we have to you. And the first one is, we are not aiming at division. There's nothing about today that the desire is to see more division, but it is a place where we want to be able to challenge one another's thinking. And we do it in an environment where we can have unity even if we think differently about what this looks like and what it means. We're also committed to maintaining the difference between ideas and like personal offense. So you and I can have a conversation about an idea, and yet I'm not going to be angry and mad at you as a person, which in today's world, it's hard to separate those two sometimes. And so that's our commitment to you. So you raise your hand and you ask a question and there's pushback, or you push back this way. The assumption that we're going to make is that you're not attacking either one of us as a person, or you're not attacking anybody at your table as a person, but you're trying to look at the idea. And so that's a commitment that we have for you. And the other reason is because we're committed to greater influence, both in your homes, on social, in your church, in your workplace. That's what we're really trying to get after here. And so we're going to ask you to make a couple of commitments too. You didn't know that, but we ask that you commit to listen first, seek first to understand, and then be understood. Stephen Covey made that famous. I don't know if he's the one that came up with it, right? But seek first to understand before being understood. And then again, that part of that thing is this a personal opposition that I have to this person, or do I just struggle with seeing things from their perspective? So that's a commitment that we would love for you to think about, and that we walk away from here challenged, maybe even tired, right? And sharpened, but not offended. But not offended. In today's world, it's very easy to get offended. And I'm not picking on your children, but when I'm offended, what do? I just unfollow or don't like, right? Or cancel, or whatever it is that you want to do. And so the goal here today is to not have any of that kind of stuff happen. What to expect for today? This is a nonpartisan discussion. Now again, right, I have biases, and there's ways that I see things, and there's a way that Tim sees things. But the goal here is this is a nonpartisan discussion. And just because we may quote somebody doesn't mean we are putting a stamp of approval on everything about their life. And so we may quote a politician. Those two guys that I quoted a minute ago, I don't know. I've never had dinner with them. I don't know that much about them besides what I can read. And so just because some of those kind of things are quoted does not mean that we endorse them. And we will have direct conversations today. And so there are three main movements of this seminar, and then we're going to jump into it, right? You're like, stop the introduction. So the three movements of this is, where are we at and how did we get here? We're at the factory in paradise. That's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about the world. Where are we at presently and how did we get here? Number two, can we find ways to discern truth from deception? And then, how should we live and lead based off of those three things? So anyway, that's where we're going to go. And Tim, get us started.
That's awesome. No, thank you, Scott. You've done a tremendous job here getting us rolling. So we're going to start into session one. We got three main sessions. That was introduction. Session one right now is going to be when and how did we get here. So I think it's very important, before we talk about how do we discern what is true from what is false, we have to be able to discern the moment we're in. And if you're like me, I don't see my blind spots, and maybe you don't see yours, but you see mine, right? And maybe I see yours. But I think collectively as a culture, we also don't see the blind spots in which we live and function. So we don't necessarily wake up and think about our worldview. I grew up as a missionary kid. My parents are here this morning, and I know that transferring from culture to culture, there are things that are just innate about a particular culture. And so when I came back here to America, I had to learn for example, how much space you give another individual in conversation. Most of us don't wake up and think, when I'm talking to another male who's about my age, definitely older, then how much space do I give to this guy, right? But I had to learn that. I had to learn, what do people laugh at here versus what they laughed at where I grew up in, right? I had to learn, what do they actually wear? So some of these things that are just, they come like breathing when we wake up, when you stop and parse them out and think about them, that's the worldview in which we live. So we want to back up for a minute and just kind of say, what is the air we breathe when we're living in North America right now? Where have we come from? So with that being said, I'm going to speak to churches first, a couple things where I think we are currently in existence with churches, some things that are going on right now. First statement I'm going to make is that about 50% of churches are dealing with conspiracy theories right now. This is from Scott McConnell, who is the executive director of Lifeway Research. He said, Christian churches resolve to be places focused on the truth, yet half of pastors hear the spread of assumptions about plots often. This is a startling disconnect. So where's the church right now? I think dealing with this. Lifeway Research goes on to say this, that pastors of churches with more than 250 people in attendance are the most likely to agree with this statement. About 61% of churches, 250 and above, are going to say we have a significant amount of conspiracy theories in our fellowship, if you will. Let me go further, that white pastors are also more likely than African American pastors to say that they frequently hear their members repeating conspiracy theories at a rate of 50% to 36%. He goes on, McConnell says this, that conspiracies are embraced by a minority of churchgoers, but the larger the church, the more minds and mouths exist to be misled. And Scott says this as well. He says, at this time, it appears that more of the theories are traveling in politically conservative circles, which corresponds to the higher percentages in the churches led by white Protestant pastors. So in churches, particularly a white Protestant, more conservative, larger church, the data simply says whether I like it or not is immaterial. Now let me take the box. What's in the box says that. How I interpret that is going to be another thing, but that's what's in the box, if you will. Okay? So secondly, not only are conspiracies showing up in churches in general, but also we need to talk about this category, and this is a difficult one for me to talk about, Scott. We've talked about this, and I come into this with some trepidation, but I think it's important that we talk about the category of white evangelicals as well. This is a category that must be discussed. Just a few months ago, in February of 2021, the American Enterprise Institute released a study on evangelicals, Republicans, and violence as their category. And here's what the AEI survey found. That about 3 in 5 white evangelicals told the pollsters that Biden was not legitimately elected, that it was not accurate to say that former President Donald Trump encouraged the attack on the Capitol, and that a Biden presidency has them feeling disappointed, angry, or frightened. On all of those questions, what was stated here in this article is that white evangelicals are politically quite distinct, separate from mainline Protestants, Black Protestants, Catholics, followers of non-Christian religions, and the religiously unaffiliated all viewed Biden's victory as legitimate. The AEI survey also found this, that white evangelicals were especially prone to subscribe to the QAnon movement's conspiracy theories. Believe it or not, 27% of white evangelicals polled said it was mostly or completely accurate to say that Trump has, in quotes, been secretly fighting a group of child sex traffickers that include prominent Democrats and Hollywood elites. That share is higher than for any other faith group and more than double the support for QAnon believers among Black Protestants, Hispanic Catholics, and non-Christians. So, as with, and here's what Daniel Cox, the director of the American Enterprise Institute, has to say, as with a lot of questions in the survey, white evangelicals stand out in terms of their belief in conspiracy theories and the idea that violence can be necessary. They're far more likely to embrace all of these different conspiracies. And to me, it doesn't matter if I like it or don't like it, I need to see what's in the box, if you will, right? I need to see the data that exists out there, and this is what is sitting there in that box. And let me push it a little bit further, if I can, and say this, and want to show you a video here in just one second. Not only is this going on in churches and in white evangelicalism in the whole, the impact of this, particularly in the Capitol riot on January 6th, is significant for the Christian church and the white evangelical church especially to address, to deal with. You may have seen, I'm sure you have seen, a variety of clips and information about what happened there on January 6th. But I have no doubt that the message of Christianity is getting cloudy following what happened in January 6th, when Jesus save signs show up along with storming the Capitol. And when we have moments like what you're about to see here, you're about to hear, I want to play about a 1.5-minute video. You're about to hear from some folks who were inside the Capitol itself on January 6th. And you're about to hear, I hope you can hear it well enough here, them offering a prayer while they have stormed the Capitol and taken over the Senate chambers there. And I want you to listen to the prayer, the content of the prayer, and imagine, if you will, whether this could be a prayer that could be prayed in if you attend a church or are familiar with people who do. Could the content of this prayer be copied and pasted into a church on a Sunday morning? And so let's listen to this moment, and hopefully we can hear it as we need to.
All the way back to the monument, all D.C.
Jesus Christ, we invoke your name. Amen.
Let's all say a prayer in this sacred space.
Thank you, Heavenly Father, for gracing us with this opportunity. Thank you.
Let me take it back.
Thank you, Heavenly Father,
Amen.
for this opportunity to stand up for our God-given unalienable rights. Thank you, Heavenly Father, for giving the inspiration needed to these police officers to allow us in this building, to allow us to exercise our rights, to allow us to send a message to all the tyrants, the communists, and the globalists, that this is our nation, not theirs.
Yes.
That we will not allow the American way of the United States of America to go down. Thank you, divine, omniscient, omnipotent, and omnipresent creator God, for filling this chamber with your white light of love, with your white light of harmony. Thank you for filling this chamber with patriots that love you and that love Christ. Thank you, divine, omniscient, omnipotent, and omnipresent creator God, for blessing each and every one of us here and now. Thank you, divine creator God, for surrounding us with your divine, omnipresent white light of love and protection, peace, and harmony. Thank you for allowing the United States of America to be reborn. Thank you for allowing us to get rid of the communists, the globalists, and the traitors within our government. We love you and we thank you. In Christ's holy name we pray.
I hope you could hear most of that. I'm sure it was. A prayer let me try to summarize it, a prayer to Jesus Christ in the Senate chambers, thanking him for his white light of love and peace that he's bringing, thanking him for that they can stop the communists, the globalists, the socialists, I think maybe the traitors, I think that word was in there. An invocation is what it was, invoking the God of heaven, the person of Jesus Christ, expressing praise and thanks that he is behind and sanctions what happened in that space. And so as we process this from my vantage point as a leader of a church, I have to see, whether I like it or not, what's in the box and what's happening. I have to see the data, if you will. What's the world in which I live in? What is going on when this kind of stuff is happening in our national landscape? The question has to be asked, what kind of impact does this have on the witness of the church and on the witness of what I would call my faith? Did Jesus Christ sanction the Capitol attack, right? But yet, this is the message that comes out in spaces like that.
There's another clip that we want you to listen to. This one might be it's going to be easier to understand and hear, okay? It's going to be a little harder to follow, A, because it's like 7 minutes long, and B, because there's not really going to be an image on the screen so much, okay? This is from a podcast, and there's a man named Ed Stetzer. Ed writes a whole bunch, and in the evangelical world, you may know his name, okay? And so he was on a podcast talking about the potential need for an evangelical reckoning.
Our next guest says white evangelical Christians need to take their share of responsibility for this precarious moment in American history. The Access Hollywood tapes, immigrant children separated from their parents, the president's incessant lies. Through it all, white evangelicals have, by and large, stood by President Trump. During Trump's presidency, they saw 3 abortion rights opponents seated on the Supreme Court, but at what cost? Ed Stetzer is the director of the Billy Graham Center at Wheaton College. He says after the deadly Capitol Hill riot, white evangelical Christians need a reckoning. You write that, quote, many evangelicals are seeing Donald Trump for who he is. Do you really think that's true? I mean, there have been so many other things Trump has said and done over the past 4 to 5 years that betray Christian values, and their support didn't waver. You think this time it's different?
Yeah, I think it's a fair question. And I've been one for years who was saying we need to see more clearly who Donald Trump is and has often not been listened to. But I would say that for many people, the storming of the Capitol, the desecration of our halls of democracy has shocked and stunned a lot of people. And how President Trump is engaged in riling up crowds to accomplish these things. Yeah, I do think so. Now, I think there's some significant and important conversations that we need to have inside evangelicalism, asking the question, what happened? Why were so many people drawn to somebody who was obviously so not connected to what evangelicals believe by his life or his practices or more?
You write that Trump has burned down the Republican Party. Let's talk about this. What has he done to the evangelical Christian movement, do you think?
Yeah, and that's my greater concern, too. He's burned down the Republican Party, emboldened white supremacists, mainstream conspiracy theories. But for me, as my particular concern, as an evangelical, as someone who's really committed to evangelical beliefs about the gospel and sharing Christ and more, to see how evangelicals have rallied in some cases, not everybody, but in some cases, regardless of what the president could do. There were evangelical enablers and there were evangelical participants. And I think ultimately that's not what we're supposed to be about. If you ask today what's an evangelical to most people, I would want them to say someone who believes Jesus died on the cross for our sin and in our place, and we're supposed to tell everyone about it. But for most people, they'd say, oh, those are those people who are really super supportive of the president no matter what he does. And I don't think that's what we want to be known for. That's certainly not what I want to be known for. And I think as this presidency is ending in tatters as it is, hopefully more evangelicals will say, we should have seen earlier, we should have known better, we should have honored the Lord more in our actions these last 4 years.
As you have indicated, you've been critical of Donald Trump from the very beginning, but you are in conversation on a regular basis with people, I assume, for whom Donald Trump represented a champion in the White House for evangelical causes. Can you explain how evangelicals convinced themselves that character didn't matter when it came to Donald Trump?
Yeah, and that's literally what happened. They changed their minds, and it happened between the Clinton administration, or President Bill Clinton, and there's actually a poll. I wrote about this years ago, and the poll said that white evangelicals at one point were the highest group of people who said that the private morality of public figures is essential, it's important, highest number. And then, in and around the 2016 campaign, they became the group of people who held that at the lowest number. And to change your view of morality in order to elect a presidential candidate, I think is the definition of selling out your beliefs. And so I think we'd have to just be honest. A big part of this evangelical reckoning is a lot of people sold out their beliefs. I do think there's a time and a place that people said, I'm not voting for a person, or there are things that he supports that I support. I really struggled. It's the lesser of two evils arguments. I think there are good people who get into a voting booth who make difficult decisions that may have made difficult decisions or different decisions than you and than I would have made. But at the end of the day, when you change your view of morality in order to make that decision, you're doing it in a way that undermines the very beliefs that should be the foundation of your life.
So what does the reckoning look like? Do evangelicals, in your opinion, need to untether themselves from the Republican Party?
I think evangelicals need to untether themselves from people who have consistently shown who they are. When people show you who they are, believe them. I think evangelicals need to untether themselves from conspiracy theories like QAnon and others that really, as you watch some of the things that took place on the Capitol building, there was a distinctly religious overtone in some of those things. And not everyone who was there for a march protesting what is kind of an untrue assertion that the election was stolen, but not everyone rushed the Capitol either. But there's too many people who named the name of Jesus or who carried a flag with Jesus' name on it that participated in wrong, sinful actions. And I think we need to ask the question. Part of this reckoning is, how did we get here? How were we so easily fooled by conspiracy theories? Why are religious people disproportionately engaged in QAnon? Why does QAnon's language sound like religious language, which thus makes it appealing to religious people? Those are the kind of things that I think a reckoning needs to come. People need to ask hard questions. We need to get back to who we are, which not everyone who listens is going to value and appreciate who evangelicals are, what they believe about God and the Bible and Christian living in the world. But we need to make clear who we are, and our allegiance is to King Jesus, not to what boasting political leader might come next.
Do you think that needs to happen from the pulpit? I mean, you talk about people needing to disavow themselves of conspiracy theories. I mean, should ministers on Sunday mornings be delivering messages about how to sort fact from fiction and discouraging their parishioners from seeking truth in these darkest corners of the internet, peddling lies?
Absolutely, absolutely. Mark Noll wrote years ago a book called The Scandal of the Evangelical Mind, and he was talking about the lack of intellectual engagement in some corners of evangelicalism. I think the scandal of the evangelical mind today is the gullibility that so many have been brought into conspiracy theories, false reports, and more. And so I think the Christian responsibility is we need to engage in what we call in the Christian tradition discipleship. Jesus says, I am the way, the truth, and the life, right? So Jesus literally identifies himself as the truth. Therefore, if there ever should be a people who care about the truth, it should be people who call themselves followers of Jesus. But we have failed, and I think pulpits and colleges and universities and parachurch ministries and more need to ask the question, how are we going to disciple our people so that they engage the world around them in robust and Christ-like ways? And I think part of the evangelical reckoning is we haven't done that well.
Ed Stetzer leads the Wheaton College Billy Graham Center. Thanks for your time.
Thank you.
So it's fascinating. And then in a second, you're going to get a chance to talk at your table, maybe about the stuff that you wrote down or just what you heard. Here's some things I wrote down. In his words, why are we as evangelicals, if that's what you consider yourself, gullible? And I began to ask myself, am I gullible? And I am. I am the most gullible person on the planet. I'm the guy that falls for every April Fool's joke. I just believe things. But part of me wants to go, no, man, when it comes to truth and who Jesus is and what the Bible says, I'm not gullible. So I don't know what to do with that. Ed Stetzer also said that there were some, and he seemed to lump more than just some, that they were wrong, sinful actions that happened at the insurrection. Wrong and sinful actions. Okay, we can talk about that. He also said, again, I tried to write these things down really quickly, so maybe I missed some or did it wrong, that President Trump is obviously not connected to, I forget how he phrased that, to God, to Jesus, to something, because of his life and practice. And so then I want to go, wow, that's a pretty strong statement. And then Scripture also says that you will know them by their fruit. So maybe it's not as strong as a statement. I don't know what to do with that. And then, two more things for me, and then I want you to talk to each other. That idea about how people like me would have said things or evaluated, I like that better than judged, evaluated Bill Clinton. I found interesting in what Stetzer said. Because I would have grown up at a time when we in church would have been like, well, you can't trust a leader that doesn't have character. I mean, if he's doing that in this part of his life, he must be, right? Does anybody else remember that? Right? And then I think I sometimes now run in circles where it's like, no, it's not about a person's character, it's about their policy. I mean, policy matters more. So we care more. So now, as a 48-year-old that might be gullible and is trying to make his way through this, I'm confused. And so I wonder if my kids or some of our kids or some of our grandkids would have been old enough to remember things like character matters, and we can't say something about, you can never vote for Clinton because he has oral sex in the White House, right? So he must be a horrible person, sorry. And then it's like, what do we do with that? And how do those kind of things fit together? All right, that's me. I'm the one that has the microphone. I'm sorry. But those are the things and feelings that were coming across to me.
If we haven't offended you yet, fear not, there's time, and I think the next part of the session may do that right now. Because we want to talk about how in the world did we actually get to this space where there is this kind of division and this kind of marriage actually between the evangelical faith block and the evangelical voting block. how did that happen? How did that arrangement merge? What did that look like, if indeed it did? So the answer, of course, is incredibly complex, and this is a combination of some of my thoughts and some things that you're going to see up on the screen. And I'm going to share more personally quickly, and that is that as I grew up politically, I was not a politically focused person growing up. I mean, my parents are great. We were in a highly political family. I don't remember if we ever had a strong political conversation. We didn't go away on political retreats or anything. I mean, there was just it wasn't a priority for us, right, growing up, to discuss these things, and that was totally fine. But I did pick up along the way, and I don't know who it was from and where it was from, but as a believer in Jesus Christ, I also would be in a position of pro-life because I think God has created all of life, right? And because of that, then for many, that leans right into this anti-abortion piece. When I say pro-life, many immediately think of a voting bloc. I'm just talking about a theological conviction right now, right? That all of life, from womb to the tomb, it should be protected, right? So with that, there's also then this marriage, because there's a voting platform in the Republican Party that would be stronger pro-life, is what some would say, and yet on the Democrat side, they'd say, yes, but we're pro-life through all of life, not just about abortion. But because abortion is such a personal and emotional and strong conversation to have, the question of how did we get here, I might argue that there's a single issue, namely abortion, that is a value held so deep by many conservative Christians, it is difficult, if not impossible, for some conservative Christians who are evangelical to possibly understand that anyone could be on the quote-unquote other side because of their deep value they hold of life and particularly a vehement opposition to abortion. It was represented really well to me when Representative Adam Kinzinger of Illinois voted to impeach Donald Trump last year. He stood out as one of just a handful of people who did that. And he received a letter on January 8th of 2021 from his family. And here's a part of what he had to say. The letter said this: "Oh my, what a disappointment you are to us and to God. You go against your Christian principles and join the quote-unquote devil's army." These are all their words. They wrote in parentheses, Democrats and the fake news media. That's how they describe the devil's army. So if you're a Democrat, you're in the devil's army is what they're saying. How do you call yourself a Christian when you join the quote-unquote devil's army believing in abortion? See that single issue they identified? To embrace a party that believes in abortion and socialism, let's throw that in there while we're writing, is the ultimate sin. That's a theological word they've used to describe a political party. And so this marriage, the single issue of abortion, is significant and has moved conservative Christians to vote in particular ways for a long time. And I understand that. I understand where that comes from. I get that. I understand that pro-life piece. But I also need to understand and verbalize this space here, that a single issue has merged faith and politics. It goes a little bit further here, and it goes into this broader category of not just single issue abortion, but also this conversation around Christian nationalism, which I'm going to let you tackle.
So Christian nationalism, I'm sure if you've been following, you've heard that term. It may be even more confusing than evangelical. Remember how we had trouble like nailing that down? So again, this is going to be very vague and hard to put our hands around. But Christian nationalism. So David French, who is an author, he said it this way: "What is Christian nationalism? It's a deep emotional attachment to a particular and excessive culture, a skewed version of history, and a false sense of marked superiority that must and will fade away." How do you really feel, David French, right? So that's one way, but here's another one, and this one will be on the screen. Matthew McCullough, he's a PhD in religious American history. He says this: "An understanding of an American identity and significance held by Christians, wherein the nation is a central actor in the world historical purposes of the Christian God." This may help, but it still gets a little bit confusing, right? How do those things fit together? And so sometimes what happens in Christian nationalism is we as Americans, and even specifically Christian Americans, from my perspective, we tend to read the United States of America into biblical texts and prophecy. I would say inappropriately, and this is where I wish we could have a really cool conversation just together, right? But like, is it possible that sometimes begins to what happens with Christian nationalism and trying to figure that out? Now, sometimes Christian nationalism and patriotism get shoved together. And I don't think they should be shoved together. So what can happen is now, because this label of, well, you're just a Christian nationalist gets thrown at you, you feel like you can't be proud to be an American. And so they can be separated. And so this idea of patriotism and being thankful, I would not have, no offense to any other country in the world, but I wouldn't have wanted to be born anywhere else. I'm thankful to be an American. I appreciate America. I love America. And yet, some of this idea can also, when taken to a far extreme, again, places us in places in God's history that we probably don't belong, and can cause us to see things a certain way. So this idea of, and Tim could do this better, so that's why I'm going to shut up and just let him try to finish this for us. But like, mixing these things can get confusing. And again, labels, I think, can be put on us or on you, and you may not think that way fully. But is there a way to separate Christian nationalism and patriotism?
Absolutely. I mean, that's really well said. And so, like, the way I would look at that is, so Christian patriotism is this view that I would want the world in which I live, the society in which I live, to be a peaceful society. Wouldn't you? I would want economic stability for everybody, wouldn't you? I would want all kids to be educated, wouldn't you? I would want the poverty gap to be reduced, wouldn't you? Like that, there's a patriotism to Christian values that I think, like that, are transferable across cultures. To where I grew up in Barbados and Grenada, that'd be transferable over there. That's Christian patriotism, saying that I want my Christian faith to make a kind of impact on the society and culture in which I live, which filters down the good common grace of God to all people, that they can thrive and grow. Christian nationalism says the United States of America has a unique historical role in the history of the world, and we must protect it and protect its values, and therefore, if the socialists and liberals are going to take over the country, we have to storm the Capitol and take it over. You see the difference between the two? Christian nationalism places the United States at a centrist role in the world historical purposes of God. Christian patriotism says, I'm a Christian, therefore I'm patriotic to the values and ethos of what it means to be Christian in whatever culture I live. That all people can be people of peace. All societies can be places where there's order and life and thriving. And so that is an incredibly important distinction to make, because Christian nationalism will make me fight for power. Christian patriotism will make me fight for service and love and the thriving of my fellow man. Two very different ways to see the world. And so the question is, where does this come from, right? And so now we have some handouts for you. These are some longer reads. And we're going to give them to you, and we're going to read them because we think you can still read, but we think it's kind of fun to read to people who can also read, okay? So here's the deal. Christian nationalism history. This is a gentleman named Thomas Kidd, who's a distinguished prof at Baylor University. This is on page 1 of your handout that is right there on your table. If you don't have it, then steal it from a neighbor, but it should be right there, page 1. So here's an attempt to try to bring a little bit more clarity on where in the world Christian nationalism came from. Here's what he said. In many ways, the fight against Soviet communism set the modern template for white evangelical engagement with politics. This helps explain why many of today's most ardent adherents of Christian nationalism are also children of the Cold War. White evangelical leaders, especially Billy Graham, framed the Cold War as a conflict between the Christian values of America and the atheism of the Soviets. White people have been the primary, though not exclusive, purveyors of Christian nationalism, partly because they have been great beneficiaries of American national power. As Graham would later admit, this spiritual framing led him and other evangelicals to see almost everything about Cold War politics through spiritual lenses. Thus, whoever was toughest on communism, example, Dwight Eisenhower, Richard Nixon, or Ronald Reagan, got transformed into Christian warriors who had God on their side. The details of a politician's personal faith didn't matter so much as their bona fides, if I'm saying that right, as a Cold War stalwart. This association of Republican politicians with the cause of Christian nationalism became more pronounced when the GOP, out of both opportunism and principle, identified itself as the pro-life party after Roe v. Wade in 1973. The fact that most traditional Protestants in America correctly regarded abortion as gravely immoral made it even more difficult, ironically, to maintain clear boundaries between Christian identity, Republican politics, and the American nation. As the secular left in the post-Vietnam War era portrayed American history as morally mixed, if not relentlessly abominable, key white evangelicals responded with God and country celebrations, even at church services, and with the formation of the moral majority. A lot of stuff in that section right there. Now, we're going to read one more thing, and then we're going to go to a discussion. We're going to let Scott read this one this time, but page 2 is going to try to ask and answer the question, in what ways is Christian nationalism more prevalent or prominent in a white conservative Protestant Christianity, and what does that mean? So again, I promise you, if we haven't offended you yet, we're going to keep trying. Not really. But this drives further into some space of the air sometimes that we breathe without realizing that we're breathing the air that we are in. So this next thing that Scott's going to read for us is going to address the issue of, is this, and to what degree is this a part of the white evangelical movement? That's the wrong word because there's not such a thing, but why is this more prevalent in a white conservative Christianity?
Anybody else feel this way? I'm cheap, but I still would have paid $500 to have lunch with Thomas Kidd, just to interact with him on what he wrote. And then maybe I'd pay more to have this conversation with David French. So you see that on the next page, page 2. Now let's ask a challenging question. Why do we see this nationalism more in white conservative Protestant Christianity than in any other strain of American Christianity, including the Black Protestant Church or the Catholic Church? I'd argue it's because that for more than 2 centuries, the United States of America was quite likely the best place in the world to live if you were a white theological conservative Protestant. No, it wasn't a perfect place, but it was the best place. Our freedom, our prosperity, and ultimately our power were unmatched anywhere else. As a practical matter, our cultural slippers fit so darn well that it grew all too easy to see ourselves in and of the United States of America. Black Christians could not feel such comfort. An enslaved person was certainly in America, but how could he or she feel truly of a land that put them in chains since the first African slaves arrived in 1619? The same analysis applies to those who suffered under Jim Crow. And while theologically conservative Catholics and Protestants now often lock arms in the modern American cultural war, that would have been unthinkable in the days when anti-Catholic Blaine amendments stalked the land. So for generation after generation, many millions of fellow believers in Jesus Christ could quite keenly feel that they were still, to greater or less degrees, sojourners and exiles in the land of their birth. They didn't have to struggle to understand in, but not of. They lived that reality each and every day. Their cultural slippers did not quite fit quite like mine. And here's the convincing reality that I've had to confront. If fellow believers, if fellow citizens struggle to overcome poverty and discrimination or justice, then perhaps I shouldn't have felt quite so comfortable. I shouldn't have felt quite so proud. Perhaps I should even wonder if my security and comfort had come at their expense. Moreover, there's also a slowly dawning realization that if I want my fellow citizens to feel more comfortable, to feel less like sojourners and exiles, then my slippers may just have to feel less snug. An expansion of Christian liberty and prosperity will inevitably mean both a change in American culture and a change in the understanding of America's past. I love this country, but I love it with eyes wide open. The aspirations of our founders have long been tempered by the brutal realities of our fallen nature. The same nation that stormed Normandy's beaches to destroy the fascist empire simultaneously sustained a segregationalist regime within its own borders. Our virtues do not negate our vices, and our vices do not negate our virtues. America isn't 1619 or 1776. It's 1619 and 1776.
It's really good and really hard to read all that. So that's a lot of content right there. What we'd like to do is have you turn to your tables again and chat and talk about a couple things. What's your take on the views that we've shared here so far? That Christian nationalism, number one, what's your take on Christian nationalism? What's your read on that? Where do you see it showing up, quote unquote, in the wild, in and around you? And also your take on the single issue that I identified earlier, the abortion issue, and its weight or its importance, its role in merging a faith and voting bloc together, if indeed that has happened, what you agree or disagree with in that space. So I would encourage you to talk to your table, particularly around the answer to the question, how did we get here? And to what degree do I understand or maybe wrestle with this concept of Christian nationalism? So by way of recap, because we're wrapping up session one, all right, here we go. What we're saying is that the majority of white evangelical church leaders reveal conspiracy theories exist in their churches. So tracking back about an hour 15 to when we started this thing, okay? We also said this, that the American Enterprise Institute data suggests that white evangelicals are more likely to believe conspiracies than any other faith groups. Just to recap. Some of the stuff we just heard from the handouts that we read, that since the GOP's alignment with Roe v. Wade in 1973, the majority of white conservative evangelicals have aligned with the Republican Party. Number 4, the gradual changing of evangelicals' belief that character matters, private morality, that is, suggests a selling out of values for political power. That was the Ed Stetzer podcast and the shifting of that view. We referenced the change in polling data from evangelical Christians in the Bill Clinton administration versus the Donald Trump administration. Evangelicals used to believe that character mattered the most, and now they're the group that says it matters the least. Number 5, on a national scale, evangelical has become more synonymous with a voting bloc of primarily white conservatives rather than a descriptor of faith. Back to your question over here, I can't read your name tag because I'm not that smart. But yeah, you asked a question about what is an evangelical. What's your name? Bob? Thank you, Bob. Appreciate that. So Bob's question, trying to separate and distinguish what is it that we mean when we use that word evangelical and the distinction between politics and faith. Number 6, we've also said this, and there's one more. Christian nationalism has silently served conservative white Protestants with a comfortable and convenient narrative within which to live in the United States for about 200 years. And number 7, evangelicals, and particularly white evangelicals, are facing a reckoning as they sense their primary narrative for making sense of their faith traditions or Christian nationalism and their political persuasions coming under attack. So we have said quite a bit. We've been fairly direct. And we are trying to be as clear as we can and as loving as we can in the presentation here. But I hope that this summary has helped summarize where we've been, or at least our assessment. And that's essentially what we're talking about, our assessment of where we see the landscape and how we're living in this cultural moment together, if you will. And again, I would expect there to be agreement and disagreement, depending upon your personality, your view, your background, your history, and your story to these things that were said here this morning.
All right, so here we go. In session number 2, we want to try to begin to answer this question: is there a way to even know truth? Now,
Great question to ask. Sorry,
I'm not done asking the question.
I know you aren't, so let me interrupt.
Okay.
You want to go further?
No,
Okay.
Tim, it's your...
So here's the funny part.
Dude, it's your world, man. I'm just living in
I
it.
appreciate that, Scott. So here's the funny thing. Here's the funny thing with truth, is that here's what I've experienced. This is just my story. Is that I've grown up in a worldview in which I have been told over and over again, maybe you have been too, Scott, that there is such a thing as basically absolute truth, right? That absolute truth exists, absolutely, okay? The irony is not lost on me in this moment that the same people who have shared that with me over the years are now telling me that there is relative truth if it serves my purpose. Are fighting for, hey, well, that's just your interpretation of the events. There are, I'm going to use this phrase that was just introduced to our national vocabulary within the past 5 years, there are alternative facts. And I'm not making a political statement by that. I'm just saying that is a phrase that has been introduced in the last 5 years to our national vocabulary. These are the same people who are saying, hey, there's absolute truth until a more relative version of truth would serve my narrative, then I'm going to go ahead and land in that space, even though there's absolute on other spaces. So when you talk about truth, Scott, it is not lost on me that the people, from my experience, many who have been champions of absolute truth are all of a sudden interested in a relative version of truth. So your question is really profound, which is why I interrupted you, because I'm looking forward to your answer to the question, what is truth? How does it work in that space? Because that's what I've seen. So thanks, Scott, for the sidebar. Carry on.
Tell you what, he's right though. And so, like, where do we go with this, and how do we figure it out? If you happen to be someone who's in the room who again has decided to align your life as closely as you can with the person of Jesus Christ, like if that's what you're trying to do, I think we would believe in absolute truth, even though we begin to taint it and change it sometimes. And I think we would say that truth is not just truth, it revolves around a person, and that person is truth. And so if there is anybody on the planet, this is from my perspective again, there you go, relative. If there's anybody on the planet that should care about truth, it should be people who follow Jesus Christ. And yet the question is, do we, or is the perception that we do? And then again, there we go back to that thing of what do I do with perception, and how does that fit in, and what do we do? And so this idea of the importance of truth is a really big deal. And then again, as a follower of Jesus, I say that this is truth. And this is an absolute truth that I can take to the bank. And it can help me navigate times when I don't know what to do. And it can help me navigate times when things feel confusing. And it can help me navigate when my eyes tell me one thing or my ears tell me something else, right? And yet, how does that all fit in, and what do we do with that? And this isn't even a discussion about the Bible and science and all of that kind of stuff. But again, if you consider yourself a follower of Jesus Christ, we should care about truth and stand up for truth in a gracious way. It should be what we're known for. Part of the Ten Commandments says that you shall not give false testimony about your neighbor. You should not bear false witness. And Pete, and I always say Scazzero wrong. Did I do that halfway decent?
Perfect.
All right, yeah. You probably know him, don't you? Okay, anytime Tim and I talk, like when I talk about people, it's because I've read their book. When Tim talks about them, it's because they've had lunch together or they taught me in school. So do you know Pete?
That's an alternative fact, what you just said.
No, it is truth. And you know it. All right, anyway. So one of the Ten Commandments says, hey, that we should not bear false testimony against our neighbor. And here's interesting that Pete Scazzero said. Every time I make an assumption about someone without confirming it, I am at risk of believing a lie about this person. I'm especially prone to this temptation when the other person has hurt or disappointed me. And I was like, that's good. Like I need to remember that part. And so we can tend to do that. Again, we can tend to jump to conclusions. I can tend to jump to conclusions. Sadly, I do it with the people I love the most. I do it with my kids. I know why you left the milk out on the counter, because you're lazy, right? I mean, that's where I go, and it might be. So what do we do with that, and how do we understand truth? And then our relationship to truth, I think, affects our witness. So again, if we are people who believe that truth is embodied in a person, and then we can allow ourselves to be tainted on what is truth, I think it ruins our opportunity to talk about the real truth. And so that's part of where we want to go.
Absolutely, it really does. And this is what, in your handout, page 3 says, and we're going to go to that right now. Dr. Mark Young, who, now this is going to be funny, he's a friend of mine.
I told you.
That's funny. But he's just Mark, okay? He was one of my profs. Anyway.
My profs told me to read books by Mark.
Oh, stop it.
So that's
all
all
right.
it is.
Mark Young, he's a good friend. Just think of him as a real, actual human being for a minute. Here's what he wrote. He's the president of Denver Seminary now. But he said, "Truth matters. What happened on January 6th was built upon months of baseless claims and willful deception about the integrity of the election. Truth matters, as do the systems and institutions in our society that are uniquely tasked and equipped to investigate, discern, and judge the truthfulness of claims and allegations of wrongdoing. Those systems and institutions have found no evidence to justify the ongoing contention that the election was rigged or stolen. The willful deception of others to accomplish one's own ends is as old as human history itself. Through the willful deception of Satan, the first humans believed a lie and acted upon that belief. Their action constituted the greatest tragedy in human history. Jesus reminds us of the destructive power of deception when he excoriates the Pharisees with these words: "You belong to your father, the devil, and you want to carry out your father's desires. He was a murderer from the beginning, not holding to the truth, for there is no truth in him. When he lies, he speaks his native language, for he is a liar and the father of lies." John 8:44 and 45. Truth matters, Mark says. It brings life. Deception brings death. As those who claim allegiance to the one who declared, "I am the way, the truth, and the life," we must not tolerate, he's speaking we as Christians, if you call yourself that, must not tolerate, originate, post, or propagate falsehoods, half-truths, conspiracy theories, baseless speculations, and other unfounded beliefs, no matter how well-intentioned or sincerely held. And we must call out those who do, no matter what office they hold. Because Christians sharing, propagating, continuing half-truths, and then on the other hand saying, "Trust me, I follow the one who is the truth," becomes an incredibly dichotomous place to live. This is why truth matters. And so it is a real challenge. And I appreciate the way Mark says this very much here.
Because just like lies have consequences, truth has consequences. And so trying to figure that out and decipher it becomes really, really difficult. And Dave, can you give us that? What was your was it Mark Twain quote about the newspaper again? Can you give it to me again, loud?
If you don't read the newspaper, you're uninformed. If you do read the newspaper, you're misinformed.
There you go. And so, thank you for that, Dave.
I don't think.
Well, I can't repeat it. So if Mark Twain said, if you don't read the paper, you're uninformed. If you read the paper, you're misinformed. There we go. Thank you. And so if that's true, what do we do and how do we decide it and how do we figure out what it is? Because, and there needs to be truth in the town square. Like, again, we have to figure out, I shouldn't say we again, as if you fit into the category of someone, again, an evangelical Christian who believes that God is who he said he was, and he came and he lived and he died and he conquered death and shame and he did all of that kind of stuff for you. And he didn't just do it for us, he did it for others. How do we share that and what do we do? And do we potentially lose the opportunity and the right to speak about ultimate truth like that when we've said other things over here? In my notes I have this, truth is a conversation in the town square. Even politicians want to evaluate truth against lies right now. And Kinzinger said this, he was quoted before, but here it is, here's something else again. Although I'm not great at citing verse and chapter, I know the Bible speaks quite a bit about conspiracies and about allowing that darkness into your heart, about the importance of truth and the importance of being a light in a dark place, of being truth. And so here's a tweet that he gave on January 12th. I think it's on the screen. I believe there is a huge burden now on Christian leaders, especially those who entertain the conspiracies, to lead the flock back into the truth. So I think that's the issue. And again, even conspiracies, even in the midst of this conversation, we're just blanketly saying conspiracies. So like, well, which conspiracy? Oh, well, like, which truth are you talking about, right? And so, but there is an obligation for people of Jesus and for leaders of his church to make sure that we're getting after truth. And so I hope in a little bit, when you get a chance at your tables, you can begin to unpack some of this, again, blanket statement about conspiracy, right, and what that means and what that looks like. Would you mind reading this next one, this
Absolutely.
Biden one?
No, I think what you're saying is so important, Scott, because the conversation about truth is not just in the Christian circles, but it also has become prevalent in the town square, as you were saying. Like, this is now a conversation that politicians are talking about. Again, this is not a sanctioning of one politician or the other. We quote people because they're talking about truth. But even President Biden, in his inaugural address, here's what he said. Part of it, not the whole thing, certainly. He said, "Many centuries ago, St. Augustine, a saint of my church, wrote that a people was a multitude defined by the common objects of their love." What are the common objects we love that define us as Americans? I think I know. Opportunity, security, liberty, dignity, respect, honor, and yes, the truth. He goes on to say this. He said, "Recent weeks and months have taught us a painful lesson. There is truth and there are lies, lies told for power and profit. And each of us has a duty and responsibility as citizens, as Americans, and especially as leaders who have pledged to honor our Constitution and protect our nation, to defend the truth and to defeat the lies." And so we want to talk about the truth. We need to talk about the truth. It is being talked about, even outside of Christian circles, as a part of how in the world do we engage the world in which we live. And so I think some of us have become afraid of naming something true and something false. I think this is part of the space that we're in, and the uncomfortable space we're in, of saying, well, that might just be what I believe. Well, I read this, and have you read this blog post, and have you seen this, and I can defend my thing by this and this and this. And then are we stuck forever as people who are never going to be able to define truth anymore? Has alternative facts deconstructed our ability to find and name truth? Are we too afraid of a political pushback or a relational pushback when we say, you know what, that actually, we need to call that a lie? You know, Mark Young from Denver Seminary, we just read earlier, would say that is what Christians need to be able to do if Christians are going to be people who say, I follow the way, the truth, and the life. That just being nice and not offending people isn't going to be the highest value of Christianity. I certainly don't want to offend people. That gives me anxiety. I'll be honest, Scott. I get anxious about that. I want everyone in the room here to like me. And who wouldn't, really? I'm not going to let anyone answer that question at all. I'm not going to answer that question. But the issue at stake, and I see it for the next generation, I see it in my generation, is can truth be known, and can it be defined now? Or are we stuck forever in a deconstructed world in which truth is gone, alternative facts live, and misleading information is out there? So let's talk about this specifically. Let's try to define things quick so we're not just assuming things. What is truth? And we're going to define it this way, real simple. We're going to Webster's on this baby. The quality of being true as conforming to fact or reality. It kind of bothered me that Webster's use a definition to define the definition. Anyone feel that pain in the room? Like, how can you say true in trying to define truth? But as conforming to fact or reality, I think, is also very important. So we're talking about things that help us get a handle on our world that conforms to the reality and fact that we can engage with truth. Now, what is a conspiracy is another question. When we use that term, what do we mean? Here's how we're going to take this one. And I'm going to run this from the European Union website, which is going to parlay into another piece here in a second. But here's how they defined it, and I like their definition. They said, the belief that certain events or situations are secretly manipulated behind the scenes by powerful forces with negative intent. All right, process that for a second. The belief that certain events or situations are secretly manipulated behind the scenes by powerful forces with negative intent. I'm going to make a statement here that I believe conspiracies are as old as people themselves. We are not in a new world with conspiracies. Our access to and the weight and pressure of them may have risen recently, but we are not in a new space. All the way back even to the Old Testament book of Nehemiah. I was reading in Nehemiah chapter 6 here recently that if you don't know that story, Nehemiah was this guy who was an Israelite who wanted to go rebuild the wall. He was given permission to go rebuild Jerusalem. There's a number of people who didn't like that, and one of those people who didn't like that was a guy named Sanballat. So Sanballat, great baby name, by the way, if you're looking for a baby name. It just rolls off the tongue, doesn't it? I'm just trying to think of a mom who'd be like, I want to go with Sanballat for this one. All right, so Sanballat is sitting there and he's saying, listen, we don't want the wall to be built. And so he In Nehemiah chapter 6, he writes a letter to Nehemiah, and he says, Nehemiah, I want you to come visit with me, and here's the reason why. Because here's what people are saying. I'm going to make you Nehemiah. He said, people are saying that the only reason that you are here is to ultimately build this city so that you can take over the kingdom. Like, here's what people are saying, just so you know. And he goes on to say that you're the one, the people that you're appointing, they're appointing as priests. You're going to set up an alternative kingdom here. You want to take over. You want power. That's what people are saying. That's a conspiracy. That is a lie. It's a deception, and it should be called as such. It's as old as people themselves. This is not a brand new thing that we're dealing with. We just have to be able to have the ability to distinguish what is true and what is false. And Nehemiah in chapter 6 says, he's like, you are making all of this up out of your head. Now, what's for lunch? I mean, it's kind of the way he responds. This is false. Who shot JFK, right? Conspiracies all over the place, right? What actually happened in 9/11? Right? Conspiracies all over the place on it. Area 51, that would be a really fun conversation to have. Conspiracies all over the place about what's going on there. Conspiracies are as old as people themselves. Before I bring this out for group discussion here, I want to go further. So hold your thoughts from what you just said, if you can. If you can't, write them down and bring them back to the group in a second, because I really appreciate, Dave, your question. Thank you for that question. It's a very important one to ask for clarity around what this means. And I think we want to push into that clarity now and then go back to the conversation you had here. Okay? So let me push on. You're going to see in your handout, because I want to talk about descriptions, further descriptions of conspiracies. I'm going to go to Michael Shermer, who, as you see at the bottom, page 4 in your handout, he's an American science writer, a historian of science, and the founder of the Skeptics Society and editor-in-chief of its magazine, Skeptic. So this is not coming from a Christian perspective. Shermer talks about conspiracies, and I very much appreciate the way that he clarifies or describes. I'm using the word describe instead of a definition for this. So I'm hoping that the description here and the next space that we're in will help us drive this further. So let me read through with you as you follow along 10 marks of conspiracies, okay? Because, anyway, let me do that. Number 1, proof of the conspiracy supposedly emerges from a pattern of, quote-unquote, connecting the dots between events that need not be causally connected. When no evidence supports these connections except the allegation of the conspiracy, or when the evidence fits equally well to other causal connections or to randomness, the conspiracy theory is likely to be false. Number 2, the agents behind the pattern of the conspiracy would need nearly superhuman power to pull it off. People are usually not nearly so powerful as we think they are. Number 3, the conspiracy is complex, and its successful completion demands a large number of elements. Number 4, similarly, the conspiracy involves large numbers of people who would all need to keep silent about their secrets. The more people involved, the less realistic it becomes. Number 5, the conspiracy encompasses a grand ambition for control over a nation, economy, or political system. If it suggests world domination, the theory is even less likely to be true. The conspiracy theory ratchets up from small events that might be true to much larger, much less probable events. Conspiracy theory assigns pretentious, sinister meanings to what are most likely innocuous and insignificant events. The theory tends to commingle facts and speculations without distinguishing between the two and without assigning degrees of probability or of factuality. The theorist is indiscriminately suspicious of all government agencies or private groups, which suggests an inability to nuance differences between true and false conspiracies. The conspiracy theorist refuses to consider alternative explanations, rejecting all disconfirming evidence and blatantly seeking only confirmatory evidence to support what he or she has said a priori determined to be the truth. A lot there, and a lot of very specific qualities there. From number 1, talking about the causal connectivity, the power to pull it off. Number two, the complexity of it, the number of people involved in it, the ambition of it, the scope of it in that sense, ratcheting from small to large, assigning meaning to it, commingling facts and fiction without separating the degree of probability or factuality to it, the suspicion of government agencies or private groups, and the inability to consider alternative explanations, blatantly seeking only to confirm evidence. So as we think even, Dave, about your question, again, appreciate it, a descriptor, further descriptors of what might be true and what might be false when it comes to conspiracies. Now, you got something, Scott? No? I'm going to keep going? I'm going to keep going. Unless you unmuted. You're about to tell me what important person you had lunch with. Let me take this further now, and then we're going to pause after this one. Flip the page onto your page 5 on your handout. This chart, I hope, will be more helpful in a simpler way for you. And I hope you can remember 3 words from this, which I'll come back to over and over again throughout this seminar. This framework is from the European Union's and UNESCO's partnership to help counter some misinformation, misleading conspiracy theories. So this is not mine. I'm crediting them as I should. So top left, they're going to give 3 criteria for identifying conspiracies. Number 1, check the author. Who is writing this and why? An unlikely conspiracy is that the author has recognized qualifications and credentials in the topic. The author uses verifiable facts and evidence from scientific or academic research. A likely conspiracy is that the author is a self-proclaimed expert and not attached to a reputable organization or institution. The author claims to have credentials, but they don't withstand scrutiny or are suspended. Number 2, check the source. Is it reliable and reputable? It's unlikely to be a conspiracy if the source has been quoted by several reputable media outlets, if the information is backed by many scientists and academics, or if independent fact-checking websites support the source and related claims. It is likely to be a conspiracy if the source of information is not clear, if the information is shared only by self-proclaimed experts, if independent fact-checking websites do not support the source and have refuted related claims. And number 3, check the tone. So if you're circling, if you have a pen around you, there's 3 words I said I would encourage you to highlight. Number 1 in the first top left is author. Number 2, source. And number 3, tone. Author, source, and tone. Author, source, and tone. Author, source, and tone. Who wrote it? Where'd they get it from? And what is the tone of this? Is it balanced and fair, or is it sensationalist and one-dimensional? It's an unlikely conspiracy. I'm continuing on the bottom column there, the bottom row, excuse me. The author does not shy away from exploring complexity, including different perspectives. The author is prepared to acknowledge limits to their knowledge. The tone is objective and factual. It is a likely conspiracy if the author presents their information as the only valid truth, if the author raises questions instead of providing answers, and if the author demonizes whoever they assume is behind the alleged secret plot. The tone is subjective and emotionally charged, and emotional images or anecdotes are used to illustrate the message.
I'm on page 5 again, and I've got like so many scribble marks on my paper I can barely read mine. I don't know what yours looks like. But, check the source. Is it reliable and reputable? I have trouble saying that word. And then it says, the source has been quoted by several reputable, that word again, media outlets. Talk about an oxymoron, all right? I mean, that's a tough. So again, what makes a reputable media outlet, right? These are all the questions that we have. And so I think what we're doing is we're beginning to ask deeper and more philosophical questions about things than just surface level, which is what we're trying to get at, okay? So so part of that question is, and again, I already turned some of you off because I told you where I get some of my news, but a helpful consideration is, where do we get our news? Where do we get it? Why did we choose to get it from there? What questions do we ask of it? What investigation, do we do on our own So where do we get some of that stuff? I have an extended quote from Neil Postman. He wrote a book a long time ago called Amusing Ourselves to Death. And when I started thinking about media and outlets and even using page 5 as a way to figure this out, this quote came to mind. To engage the written word means to follow a line of thought, which requires considerable powers of classifying, inference making, and reasoning. It means to uncover lies, confusion, and overgeneralizations, to detect abuse of logic and common sense. It also means to weigh ideas, to compare and contrast assertions, to connect one generalization to another. To accomplish this, one must achieve a certain distance from the words themselves, which is in fact encouraged by the isolation in impersonal text. That is why a good reader does not cheer an apt sentence or pause to applaud even an inspired paragraph. Analytical thought is too busy for that and too detached. Well, that was a lot of words. But I think there is something in there about how do we approach, and how do I approach? And when I read something and instantly I'm like, yeah! Have I then stopped thinking just because someone said something that resonated with me? And again, how do I go after that? I thought about media, and this is a media thing. This is an ad for cigarettes in the 1930s, which I thought was just fascinating when I found this online. 20,679 physicians say that Luckies are less irritating. Right? And so, again, we now look at this, and now we know things about cigarettes that maybe they knew then, or maybe they did. I have no idea. But, we look at that now, and we're like, that's an absurd advertisement. And then we begin to ask questions about, okay, so you may die less irritatingly, but you're still going to die, So, what does that mean, and what does that look like? So, again, we look at that, and we kind of laugh, and yet, is our world, and are we able to see things that looks a little bit different than this today and still be able to say, no, right? I mean, we ask questions about the assumptions that are being made or not made, or the things that are being left out or not left out. All right, on the back of your handout, page 6, and some of you are like, page 6, we're done? No, you got to come back after lunch. Just your handout is done. But this is an interesting piece. And you see at the bottom it says the media bias chart 2018. And here's the part that I have trouble about this. And yet I'm with Tim. I mean, truth has to be truth, and we have to be able to go, no, that's an objectable truth. And yet somebody made this chart. Does that make sense? Like somebody made this chart and said that these... But let's just look at it, and it might help you if you've never seen something. And this is a very famous chart. Famous doesn't make it truthful. But it's a very famous chart that is out related to media and bias, and you can see up at the top there's a column, and along the side there's a column. And it would be interesting, and maybe you would do, what? Tim?
Oh, go ahead.
Did you have your hand up?
I did have my hand up.
Well, then go.
Is that awkward because you're presenting?
No, go.
As you go into that, here's something someone told me the other day, I think it's so important, especially if you're in the church. Like in the church, we get about an hour of people's time a week.
Yep.
But this, what you're looking at right now, this can be 20 hours a week. This can be 120 hours a week. That would give me a massive headache. But my point is, most of our people, regardless of faith persuasion, are more discipled by this page than most anything else, whether they consume that through their phone or online or in print. But this is an incredibly important space, in my opinion, to be able to find out how am I being discipled? I'm not using that not in a Christian phrase, but how am I being discipled? How am I being shaped? How am I being formed in my thinking? Because this shapes us for hours every week. I'm done.
No, it's very true. And I would tell you that our children and grandchildren are being shaped by things that don't even show up on this page, right? Like social media. And obviously that's being influenced by somewhere else too. And so you add the social media piece into this mainstream media piece, and Tim's right, the discipleship process is happening all around us all the time. But the question is, can we identify it, and can we go, oh, wait a minute, somebody's trying to influence me in a certain way, and so what do we do? So you may choose to look at your favorite one, right, and go, oh, let me see where they put it, and then you may begin to ask questions about that, or it would be fun to continue that conversation again. But this is a place to go and to look. We'll put the National Enquirer, the Enquirer down there. You see that in the middle of the page down at the bottom? And so it says this is where that belongs. Tim, what is your favorite news source?
The Bible.
Oh, jerk.
And my wife. Does that work?
It works.
So let's talk more about you and CNN, Scott. Should we do that? So
We can.
So what I like to do for the fun of, since we're sharing media sources, right? So I'll tell you what I like to do. I like to hit for a balance. Here's my traditional route. I will hit CNN. I will hit Fox News. I will hit NPR. I will hit Reuters. I'll hit AP. All right? I'm trying to go left. I'm swerving all over the road. And reason being, I want to read people who I don't agree with, people who I think are on the far right, who are more left, people who are maybe more centrist. And I don't spend hours on it, but I'm typically, as I'm getting up in the morning, getting going with my day, as I'm grabbing lunch or whatever and have time, I'm generally scanning in and around that space and just really circling around that area and trying to figure out what in the world is up.
You want to summarize this?
Let's take us to lunch with this. Let's summarize where we've been. Session 2 recap here briefly. Truth and deception matters. We cannot casually dismiss conspiracies. Real people are hurt or killed. Young people are misled, etc. There are real-life consequences to lies. There are real-life consequences to conspiracies and truth as well. All right, so it matters. Number 2, knowing the marks of conspiracies can help us discern more likely from less likely versions of truth. Number 3, I've said it before, I'm going to highlight this again. Consider, as you process the information you get, consider author, source, tone. And finally, this for now, then we're going to hit lunch. Identifying the source of the bulk of our news can help keep us balanced. I love and hate that word. Howard Hendricks, one of my profs at Dallas Seminary, used to say that balance is that place you're finding yourself in when you're swinging from one extreme to the other. Generally, that can be true. I understand what he means. So balance, I don't hold too tightly as a destination, but I recognize that we do want not to just be persuaded one side or the other. We are running into session 3 now. So we've talked a little bit about our landscape, where we are, where we come from, the Christian nationalism view, the air we breathe, about waking up in this space and trying to identify that. We talked and we got into some good discussion last time about what is truth, can we know it? Talked about trying to identify conspiracies, even trying to define it. What does that mean? What does it look like? Trying to get some handles and framework around conspiracies, what it means to move forward with that. Now, part of our landing of this plane is going to be, so what? How do we then live and lead together, right? And this is part of what I came to this thing with, and I think probably you did too, Scott, is a relational tension around, and I think, I forget your first name. Dale? Dale mentioned early on that his own daughter defriended, I guess, on Facebook. Is that right? Did I say that right? So the relational tension that exists even among families, like how do we relate to one another in this space? And so this last time session is going to be an attempt to land some of this stuff into that space and say, okay, are there ways that we can get along without destroying relationships? And what does that actually look like to try to work through this together? So as we start with that, I think it is just one place that's important to stop by as a transition point. And I think this is something that will not be a surprise to us based on our conversation so far today, but I want to talk briefly about the impact of conspiracies on evangelicalism. We've talked about some of that, but just a couple of quotes for the fun of it here before we talk about how to relate to one another. Lifeway Research in a January 26 article was speaking about U.S. Protestant pastors and hearing conspiracies in their church, and Mary Jo Sharp Christian apologist put it this way when we're thinking about the impact of conspiracies on evangelicalism. She said this, that irresponsibility with information unravels the impact of a Christian's witness to those in their community and, with social media, to the broader world. The non-Christian may begin to believe or become further ingrained in the culturally popular belief that Christians are anti-intellectual, including anti-science. And so when we think about the implications of why does it matter that we try to deal with and nail down conspiracies, understand them, engage them, and be able to properly define or talk about them. If you call yourself a Christian, I can agree with where Mary Jo Sharp is coming here, that the impact is significant in that it can further entrench these values or beliefs that already exist in this space. I also think this, and then I'm going to move on to the next category, that we need to be honest about the impact of this on our relationships with one another. This is where Peter Scazzero in Emotionally Healthy Relationships put it this way. He said, when we exchange reality for a mental creation, such as a hidden assumption, we enter a counterfeit world. And at that point, we exclude God from our lives because God does not exist outside of reality and truth. We also wreck relationships by creating needless confusion and conflict. That's a powerful idea. That if I'm going to interject in between our relationship a counterfeit world or a hidden assumption, oh, those liberals, oh, they must watch Fox News. Socialist, racist, whateverist there is. When we've talked about labeling already, and I've appreciated the labeling conversation. These hidden assumptions sometimes that we have about people, we can enter this counterfeit world, and at that point, we exclude God from our lives. God doesn't exist outside reality and truth, and we wreck relationships by creating needless confusion and conflict. So this is a space I have seen, and I appreciate the words that Scazzero uses to put behind some of the reality that I have felt, and maybe that you have felt in the past year or plus. So let me press into this space next. And that is around this question of what do we do if we fall for conspiracies? I don't think anyone in the world would raise their hand and say, I love admitting that I fell for a conspiracy. You know what I'm saying? I mean, none of us would. We'll kind of defer that. We'll turn that. We'll try to deflect that. I think that, I don't want to speak for you, but I think that would be my tendency. Is, well, I didn't have all the information yet. You sure it's a conspiracy? Like, it might be true. Have you read Wikipedia yet? Because I'm sure that's trustworthy. So I've appreciated a couple people, and one is going to be Ed Stetzer on this. So if you or someone you love or know has fallen for conspiracy theories, but in particular, before we talk about others, if you would allow yourself to have a moment to consider, what if I have fallen for conspiracy theory? That's hard. Because I don't think I do, right? I think I'm smart enough not to fall into that, right, Scott? But man, sometimes I do, right? Sometimes I begin believing something, and I realize later that's just not true, or it wasn't true. And so I appreciated where Stetzer goes on a couple things. One is this idea here: if you fall for conspiracies, don't excuse it. Here's what he had to say in an article in July 2015. I'm going to say the date again, 2015. This was 7 years ago. This was a long time ago, relatively speaking. Some of you are older are like, wow, 7 years. Like Scott, old. Anyway, sorry, was that too much right after lunch, Scott? Okay. Here's what he said, July 2015. He said, don't excuse it by saying it might be true. Or, well, there's something like that, or it'll be true soon. He said, no, just say you were wrong. You fell for a hoax, say it and move on. You were deceived, it's okay to admit that. You don't have to try to cover your tracks and make some sort of lame excuse to make yourself look better. Have some humility, be willing to admit someone fooled you, and move on. That is not easy. I don't know anyone who loves that, taking that humble pill. But, number one, don't excuse it, because it doesn't get any better there. And then number two, and I've appreciated this from a different space, correct it. This is, I think, so important. If we fall for conspiracies, post a retraction, particularly on social media. If we have shared something that we later have come to believe, man, this isn't right. I was in the moment, right? And I thought it was a good thing to share, and later it's like, yeah, this isn't it. Post a retraction. Admit it. It's not difficult. It may not feel comfortable. Stetzer wrote about it this way. He said, here's an example. Just say, hey, friends, I posted a story about such and such this weekend. And it turns out it wasn't true. Hey, be on guard and don't believe everything you read out there. I'll be more careful next time. Pretty simple. I like that. Pretty simple. Okay. I made that mistake. All right. Integrity, Proverbs 2:20 and 21 says, follow the way of good people and keep to the paths of the righteous. For the upright will inhabit the land, and those of integrity will remain in it. Don't excuse it, correct it, and then let me go into this one. I've appreciated Brett McCracken from the Gospel Coalition. Here's what he had to say about this. He said, don't make the mistake of whataboutisms. Like, what in the world does that mean? And this one is an interesting one to pause on for a minute. What in the world is a whataboutism? Clearly, it's a very appropriate term. Isn't that in Webster somewhere? Whataboutisms. Here's what he means by that. How many of you, when you were kids, I have a sister, and she's in the room, so she's already been called on. So here's the deal, and my parents are in the room too, so there's honesty in this space. So when I'm told when I'm younger, clean my room, Tim, you got to go clean your room. You know what my instinct is? What about my sister in her room? Right? Right? Which was always messier than mine. Fact. Not an alternate. What about something or someone else? Hold on, you're telling me to do something I don't want to do. Well, what about her room? Whataboutisms are natural defense mechanisms that deflect and push away a good argument. In other words, this is going to be, I think McCracken gives us an example in his story, in his article. He says, I'm broadly quoting him here, it would almost be like someone coming up to you and saying, you know, we need to address the issue of poverty in our community. To which you might say, yeah, well, what about the bridge that is out in our community as well? What are we going to do about that? And the answer should be, why don't we address both? It creates an unnatural and unnecessary dichotomy that doesn't need to exist. And so whataboutisms around the January 6th event. Yeah, you think that was white evangelicals? What about Antifa? What are you going to do about that? What about BLM? What are you going to do about that? Ooh. How about we deal with all injustice? How about we deal with all of these issues? And how about we find some nuance for conversation? And so this whataboutisms, I appreciated the way McCracken uses that term, because the whataboutism mentality is going to encourage us to eliminate nuance and embrace generalization and fight and defend my territory, rather than say, you know what, you're right. We need to deal with that as well. We need to deal with both poverty, and I understand that that bridge is out. That's a problem too. We are complex people, and we can handle that kind of complexity. But what I see in this space is we have to be able to recognize the wisdom on both sides, that both of these things can be dealt with. And so if we're falling for conspiracies, you know, being careful not to make the mistake of what about, well, you said this, yeah, well, what about that? There's value in saying there's a complexity here that should be embraced. Does that make sense, Scott?
It makes sense to me. At our church, on our staff, we said that there was a phrase we weren't allowed to use for a while, and it hasn't come up in a while, so we haven't had to, yeah, but. So McCracken is smarter than I am, so he called it whataboutism. We just called it the yeah, buts. And it was interesting to see as we stopped using yeah, but, conversation actually went places, I think, and I think it was appropriate. I love your example about what you were talking about your sister in her room. I'm thinking his was dirtier, right? But I just looked in Scripture. There's another example of that. Jesus at the end of the Gospel of John says, Peter, this is how you're going to die. He lays out for him how he's going to die. And then Peter goes, yeah, but what about them? John 21, he goes, what about them? And then Jesus kind of goes, if I want them to remain alive until I return, what is that to you? I mean, Jesus gets really snarky with him. But it's that same sort of thing. It's like, no, listen, I'm talking to you. If I want to have a conversation about this over here. So anyway, I'm just rambling.
really
but
good.
that whataboutism or yeah, but is pretty, it's a big deal.
And so where that shows up in the wild is very, very concrete example. One person is offended by Donald Trump's language on social media or the way that he engaged on Twitter or Facebook on January 6th. And they bring up that issue and someone else is like, yeah, well, what about what this says about the power of Twitter and Facebook and who they're owned by and what their biases and what their slant is. You see, the real problem here is big media and big companies that have an agenda against our world and free speech. That's the real problem. So what if both need to be addressed? Right? What if both need to be listened to and heard? And so this whataboutism is a quick and defensive way. I'm like, yeah, what about her room? That needs dealt with. I like what he had to say on January 6th. I like that Twitter kicked him off. What about the complexity that is a part of our human nature that we can embrace because we're capable and able to do that? So, encouraging care around that space of whataboutism, I think, is very important. Okay. One more thing, and then we're going to do a little discussion around your tables. Encouragement here to avoid conspiracies. I'm going to do some repeat here because I think that's helpful. But I appreciate Mary Jo Sharp again. She asked the question, and I like it, to avoid conspiracies. Before you post on socials, before you propagate a story, I like her question. It doesn't cover everything, but it is important, I think, and helpful if you're a person of faith in Christ in particular. She asked the question, how will this affect my ability to share the good news of Christ? So imagine you're posting on Facebook, on Instagram, Twitter. Visco is only pictures.
It's only pictures, yeah. You're trying to be cool, bro. Just stay in your lane.
I'm trying to.
Just kidding.
Oh, you mess with my Visco account, man? No, I know. But listen, my point is, like, right after I post and share whatever, can I then equally, within the next half hour, post something about how Christ is the good news for the world? And if I can't do that, then maybe I shouldn't do the first one, I guess is what I'm saying. So I've appreciated that simple question about whatever in the world I'm going to throw out there. And then again, because I said it before, I'm going to come back to it again. Consider author, source, and tone as you process how to avoid conspiracies.
So we're talking about strategies, in a sense. How do you have conversations with people that you love who think differently than you do or have fallen for a conspiracy and it can become a point of tension? So I think what I heard you said, let's do that in person. You know, can we disagree without being disregarding to each other? And sometimes that's really, really hard because a lot of times I do that personally. I will sometimes make my ideas me. Right? And so that's a really, really hard thing to do. But can we disagree without being disregarding? And Henry Nouwen said this, that love leads to listening. Love leads to listening. And when we really love and genuinely want to have that and feel that for somebody, I think our ears open a little bit wider. Back to Pete Scazzaro. He just says this. Is it on the screen? Oh, yeah, it is. So you can see it there. From experience, we know that those who care for you become present to you. When they listen to you. When they speak, you know they speak to you. And when they ask questions, you know it's you for your sake and not their own. Their presence is a healing presence because they accept you on your terms and they encourage you to take your own life seriously. That's some pretty heavy words. But it's a very unique way to look at situations with people. And listening well really can just provide a safe place for dialogue. And I think that's what we want because, I don't know, I'd love to have opportunities to share and to be open with people. And I find the duplicity in that myself, just so you know. let's say I'm having a conversation. I've got a friend now. We have breakfast every other week, and he is not a follower of Jesus Christ, and I am. And that's the whole reason we're getting together. Like, he's the one that set it up. I could tell you the whole story. But, what I want to say to him, would you at least be open to the possibility that God exists? And yet at the same time, if he turned the tables on me and said, okay, Scott, would you at least be open to the possibility that he doesn't exist? I'd be like, no. So I don't know what to do with that. Does that make sense? Like, I'm asking him to do something that I myself am not willing to do. And I realize I can go down a whole rabbit trail, but there's something about listening and honoring one another that is super important. And I think people can smell, it sounds kind of weird, but I think people can smell authenticity. Right? I mean, they can, and I think you do that when you're sitting with someone. You can tell whether they really, really care about you or they just care about getting their point across. And so what would it look like if we were more authentic? And authentic doesn't mean we have to back down from what truth is. Authentic doesn't mean we have to be wishy-washy. Authentic doesn't, right? None of that stuff. But still willing to have the dialogue. So thank you for those popcorn ideas of how to do that well. I wrote some down and have other ones stuck up here.
That was all really good. Really helpful. So many things I wanted to react to and comment on, but I'm gonna save that for now and move to our next session, next spot here real quick. As we are landing the plane on this whole seminar here today, we're thinking right now in this session about the impact of conspiracies on our relationships and how we engage them. But I also want to wrap with a view toward the future in thinking about, particularly from a Christian perspective, what is the future, if you will, what's the future for Christian discipleship? What does it look like to engage a next generation in Christian formation in a world in which we currently find ourselves now? What does spiritual formation look like when we're dealing with the cultural, social, political climate that we're in now and trying to address all of these things? So just a couple of thoughts. These are mostly from my little brain from a variety of places. So take them, leave them, whatever you might like to do, but here's a couple of things for the fun of it, and then we'll have a final discussion together. But first of all, I would say Christians must distinguish between true and false, and I identified that earlier in the room as we were talking about that there must be, in my estimation, as we think about the future, Christians must be able to call what is false, false, and what is true, true. We have to be able to have those courageous labels. It's weird that I even have to call that courageous. But there are some things that need to be called what they are. I'm not calling for no nuance. I'm not calling for being unloving. But I am saying that Christians must be able to distinguish and then call things true or false without being jerks about it, if I can put it in the vernacular. Okay. Second thing, white evangelicals should consider Christian nationalism's impact on their faith expressions. So from what we've already covered here today, I do think it is wise for those who find themselves in that category of white evangelical, even if you don't feel like the data describes you, which I get. I totally get that. I'm sympathetic to that space. However, there still is room to consider, even leaving here and going forward, how much of the world in which I live in the United States of America, in my Christian faith tradition as a white evangelical, has been shaped by an unspoken framework of Christian nationalism. That's a worthwhile thing to consider. Thirdly is this. I believe that discipleship must include not only biblical awareness, but social and cultural awareness as well. That's not necessarily new. I was a missions major in college and also in graduate school, but I'm simply talking about cultural awareness and adaptivity, being able to see the world and culture in which we exist, meaning that we must understand how we live and have lived among our neighbors, not just how to follow Jesus individually. Meaning I can say that I'm going to have a quiet time 5 days a week for 15 minutes, for 1 hour, for 9 hours, whatever it is you want to say, that I'm following Jesus individually. But if I'm not engaging in the social and cultural needs around me, I'd have to ask the question, am I really engaging the world that Jesus has put me in? And this is where I think part of our future has to be, which is also where I'll go down here. Finally, these are the 4 points that I believe the future for Christian discipleship is also getting into our town square. That with a more robust Christian discipleship, it should include, and this is part of what's in me and also part of what we talk about at Grace Point Church, but we want to be involved in what we call the social, spiritual, and cultural good, that each of those matter. This is not a church advertisement at all right now, but that understanding what the good is socially in our community. When we talk about that, we talk about how do people relate to people. What is common good for how people relate to people? What is common good culturally for how people relate to the systems around them, like the education system, the housing system, the transportation system, the economic system? What is the common good there? And then spiritually, how do people relate to God, and how can we connect with them there? That a future of Christian discipleship is a future in which, yes, we connect to Christ, yes, we have a biblical awareness, but yes, also we have a growing and engaged worldview in which we are deeply entrenched and engaged for the social and cultural and spiritual good of the people around us, which includes all of what we've already identified here with listening, pausing, learning, being willing to sit and listen. We have the privilege in our community of having a group of people who already do this. The Together Initiative Network is a network of about, I don't know how many people, number of organizations, 60-some organizations that work together for our common good in our community around here. And when I say this, here's what I mean. Like, just this week I was able to sit in a room with a number of folks. One of them was the assistant to the superintendent at our school district here at Pequot Valley in our region. He told me this data. He said, did you know, and I did not know this, so did you know that there are about 1,424 kids in our district, something like that. 720 of them, a clean half of those kids, are in a family that makes $34,000 or less a year, putting them well below the poverty line nationally. So half of the kids in our district here alone are living in a home in which 34 grand is it for the year, which is stunning to me. Not that it happens sometimes, but that it happens to that degree. And so as we sit there and talk about, and our goal in that conversation was how do we improve the third grade reading level in our area? It's at 60%. We want to get up to 90% in 5 years. Now you may be sitting there thinking, why does that matter to a church? Why does it matter to Christians? Because I think this is the future of Christian discipleship. It matters because everyone's journey matters in that sense, that every story matters in that way, that the kids in our community, regardless of their faith persuasion, are people who are made in the image of God, is my belief. So their ability to read at a third grade level matters. And so as I think about the future of Christian discipleship, I believe strongly that it includes not just a biblical awareness, although it does include that, but it also includes a societal engagement, a social and cultural engagement with people in the trenches of the mess that we are all in together at a personal level and at an institutional level, of loving each other personally, but also loving each other organizationally. And so as I look to the future, in all of what could divide us, in all of the true and false junk and the conspiracies and the falsehoods and all that, I look to a space where there's people. I want to go back for a minute. I want to go back to Christian patriotism. We ran by it quickly. Remember that a couple hours ago? Patriotism versus nationalism, where Christian patriotism will say, as a Christian, as a believer in Jesus Christ, I want the community in which I live, whether it be in Bangladesh, whether it be in Kenya, whether it be here in the United States of America, I want this community to be a community of peace, of justice, of freedom, of life, of flourishing for everybody. And that, to me, is part of the future of Christian discipleship that doesn't encourage and embrace the divides, but finds ways to lean across those divides. So going all the way back to that, that's part of my hope for the future of Christian discipleship. All right? I hope in all of this space, speaking particularly to Christians and those who call ourselves evangelical, that we can find our center again in exercising the two greatest commandments, to love God and love our neighbor. And loving God means loving truth and seeking its clarity as much as possible. Loving one another challenges us to fill the space between us with the best and not the worst, the best assumptions and not the worst, to give charity and not chastisement, to listen so that I can be present with you. And loving one another means loving those who don't share our past. Denise, I think you made that point earlier. And engaging our world with a courage by listening to those whose stories are very different than ours, that I might dislodge even the most deeply held assumptions about how our faith is expressed in this world. So my hope would be that as we engage this space, that we can find a center again. I think, Daniel, you were talking about loving God and loving others. We've heard that phrase. Many have been in the church have heard that phrase before. But that we can pursue a God of truth and be able to tell better versions of truth from lesser versions of truth, and find a way to reach across these divides, to see the space as a space that love demands that we fill, rather than a place for battleground between us. So thank you for being here. I just want to affirm your engagement. Thank you for the variety of viewpoints that were shared, for your feedback that you will be giving in that space, and anything personal you'd have to share with either one of us, we'd welcome as well. It's been an honor to be with you guys here today.
I believe that Scripture is truth, whether I'm able to fully identify with it or not. I think it tells me what truth is, but there's a verse in the Old Testament that says, as iron sharpens iron, so one person or one man sharpens another. And as I was just sitting here reflecting on today, I think I got a chance to watch that. Like, I got to watch that live out, iron sharpening iron. So I just say thank you for that. And I hope this isn't the last time we are able to dialogue about this subject or other ones. So thank you to the Factory. Kylie, just pass that on to the Factory for us, please, to be able to use this space. And what a wonderful example in our community of going after those sectors or spheres, whatever you said before about Christian discipleship. I mean, this is a place that gets a chance to do this. So it's fascinating to me. I think about it this way: the Old Testament, there were 613 of them, but like 10 commandments, right? There's these 10 things, and then Jesus comes along, and they're like, well, which ones are the most important? And Jesus goes, well, you know what? Let me give you these two, and everything hangs on these two. And then later on, I think he almost goes from 10 to 2 to 1. And then he says this. He says, love as I have loved you. And I think that applies to how we love one another inside the church, and I think it applies to how we love one another outside the church and with different ideas. And so this was super helpful to me. And so thanks for sharpening me today. So let me pray for us. God, thanks for a space to do this. Help us. We're just not wise enough. We're just not wise enough to see through the crap sometimes, the fog. And so we lean into you to help us determine and to find truth and to love truth, to love it in such a way that it affects what we say and what we think, but it doesn't cause us to become gross, belligerent, nasty, arrogant people. So thank you for the way that you embodied that, and that you really were the perfect example of grace and truth. And may we live that way as well. Thank you. It's in Jesus' name that I pray all of these things. Amen. Amen.